dear Rector Magnificus, distinguished doctoral committee, and advisory team members, dear family, friends, and colleagues, near and afar, it is an honor to be here in your presence. What happens when a disaster like an earthquake or drought occurs in a place affected already by high-intensity conflict? Imagine this scenario. There is a large humanitarian crisis resulting from high level of conflict, but coordinating aid is complex. Getting access to the places affected can be dangerous. The territories are divided between governments and armed groups, and often there are not enough resources to aid everyone. Imagine that now a disaster occurred on top of the conflict, making this whole scenario even more complicated and the possibility to respond even more difficult. Sadly, this co-occurrence of disasters and high-intensity conflict is becoming more and more common. Put simply, if disasters are based on people's vulnerability, then disasters are more likely to occur in places affected by conflict, because conflict intensifies vulnerability and reduces response capacities. Despite this, there is a low level of knowledge on how disasters and conflict interact in places affected by high-intensity conflict, and also how to respond when they do. In fact, the main frameworks guiding disaster response and risk reduction, like the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, highlight the important role of governance, but they do not mention what happens when governance is fractured, for example, in places affected by conflict. In other words, disasters occur in places with high-intensity conflict, but these places present challenges and governance problems that make it difficult to respond and address them. How is it possible, then, to coordinate aid for people affected by both disasters and conflict at the same time? Well, the main aim of my PhD research was to investigate this complexity, the process of responding to or reducing the risk of disasters in places affected by high-intensity conflict. Before I move forward to the details of this research, let me share with you some background information on how I became involved in this PhD. First, for the last 15 years, I have been working on and studying the relationship between social and environmental systems, including conducting research and coordinating disaster response to tsunamis, landslides, and earthquakes. During this time, I was always wondered, how do we know what to do when disasters occur in places affected by crisis? I was researching and studying this in my previous work when the opportunity to do a PhD in this topic arose. In 2016, I had the chance to join When Disaster Meets Conflict, a 5-year program financed by the Dutch Research Council. This project studied disaster response in places affected by conflict, and, importantly, it recognized that different conflict scenarios present different challenges for disaster response. The project involves 3 simultaneous PhD projects about disaster response, but in different conflict scenarios. One in post-conflict settings, one in low intensity, and one in high intensity conflict. As part of this project, my own PhD focused on disasters happening in high intensity conflict settings, or HIC, from now on. To that end, my research question was, how is disaster governance shaped, and how are disaster response and disaster risk reduction promoted and implemented by aid and society actors in places affected by high-intensity conflict? To answer this question, I designed a qualitative, small N case study methodology with 3 cases. Previous research on the disaster conflict nexus tend to focus on one single case, large N samples, or on post-conflict or low-intensity conflict settings. Selecting 3 cases allowed me to balance between, on the one hand, having a relevant contextual analysis in each case, and on the other, being able to compare them. Moreover, the general strategy was to have a particular focus of study in each case. As a result, my 3 country cases were South Sudan in 2017, with its droughts, floods, and civil war, This case focuses on decision-making processes in key scenarios. Afghanistan in 2018, also facing drought and floods in parallel to conflict. This case delves into disaster risk reduction. And Yemen in 2019, which studied how disasters such as drought were responded to and prevented during and before times of war, in particular focusing on the transition from development and disaster risk reduction to relief and humanitarian aid. Together with more than 15 months of fieldwork research, this PhD included a literature review across the fields of humanitarian aid, disaster response, and disaster risk reduction, or DRR from now on. To describe and analyze the information collected, I developed a theoretical framework using the concepts of aid society actors, everyday politics, and power relationships of disaster governance. Let me share now some key findings. In the case of South Sudan, I developed the notion of triage of aid to study the continuous political decision-making processes in key scenarios. I found that humanitarian action is largely locked into path-dependent areas of intervention. This means that agencies tend to stay and work in the same areas and sectors over time, rather than moving to locations where aid is needed the most, contradicting their supposed ability to quickly respond to emerging crises. In Afghanistan, I found that DRR can play a relevant role in key dynamics, both positive and negative. For example, building DRR mitigation structures can create division between communities, but they can also bring people together and reduce conflict. However, this requires sufficient time and funding to be available, that disaster governance arrangements be in place, and that different levels of conflict be acknowledged. Understanding that conflict and disasters interact at the micro level, meso level, and macro-national levels. In the case of Yemen, I found a lack of knowledge and coordination in the transition from development and DRR to relief. This also reveals spaces and opportunities to integrate both types of assistance and to address people's vulnerability to disaster before and during conflicts. My comparative analysis of the cases found that disaster response and DRR are possible and needed during peak moments, but the scale and impact of those actions are likely to be limited. One element making DRR possible is the existence of areas not directly affected by the main conflict, sometimes called pockets of peace, allowing for the implementation of projects during peak times. Also, disaster-related actions can cause conflict, harm, and power imbalances. Therefore, disaster actions need to be conflict-sensitive. In addition, due to the lack of capable governance structures and significant levels of state fragility, decision-making and coordination of disaster response and DRR rely on top-down agendas that are adapted and politically negotiated by multiple aid and society actors at different levels. Now, multiple challenges and limitations need to be considered. Doing research in 3 cases of high-intensity conflict is difficult. In these 4 years, I had to prioritize what to study in more depth. Given this timeline and an in-depth analysis of the conflict, historical and colonial background of each case was challenging. The same can be said for studying everyday politics and practices, especially because security and logistical limitations prevented me from doing more fieldwork in some regions of my country cases. Future research and the very same findings presented here will benefit from including this information in more depth in the future. This research today is more relevant than ever. The United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction has declared this year as the year of disaster governance. But, as we have seen, there is a lot to do in terms of governance in places affected by disasters and conflicts. Climate change shows its effects more and more with each passing day, impacting vulnerable people the most, among them people affected by conflict. Coming to the end, let me highlight some contributions of this study. Empirically, I present real case evidence and knowledge based on fieldwork research in South Sudan, Afghanistan, and Yemen, studying a broad range of factors and practices. This research also provides novel information about disasters in these countries. For example, it gives the first account on DRR in Afghanistan and the first disaster country profile in South Sudan. Theoretically, it has contributed to literature by bridging humanitarian and disaster studies, thereby allowing for the study of disaster-related actions in an interdisciplinary manner. This research also deepens and sharpens the concepts of high-intensity conflict, triage of aid, and the development and humanitarian aid nexus. My dissertation also contributes to debate on the relationship between disasters and conflict, the path dependency of humanitarian action, and to the study of real governance, decision-making, and coordination settings processes of disaster governance. These theoretical contributions have resulted, among others, in journal articles and reports developed working together with NGOs. Methodologically, I contribute to the development of safer and more secure fieldwork procedures, while operationalizing ethical norms in research practices. In particular, I co-authored a manual on fieldwork safety and security, and facilitated multiple training programs on the topic. Moreover, I would like to share some important insights and recommendations for policy and practice. First, DRR in high-intensity conflict is necessary. Despite its often limited short-term feasibility, it brings positive long-term benefits and can act as a springboard for future DRR once hig times has passed. Second, it is necessary to include conflict in disaster policies and agendas, especially global agreements like the Sendai framework. This will require the mobilization of funds and the development of a long-term strategy. And third, DRR and disaster response in HIG requires better and more informed links with humanitarian and development agendas. In conclusion, I hope this research, with its practical, empirical, and theoretical contributions, can help us to better respond and prevent disasters in places affected by conflict. Because it is possible to do so. Because this is about people's livelihoods. And more importantly, this is about people's lives. Thank you.